Okay, so Bezras Hashem, tonight we're going to be continuing with our weekly series of shirim on the Torah of the Goyin and the Tzaddik Rav Yitzchak Meyer Morgenstern Shlita, titled Entering the Sea of Wisdom. And tonight, again, we had a week of 89 pages of Torah from the Kodesh HaKadoshim, Mibein Shnei HaKruvim. But nevertheless, what we're going to focus on through an act of tzimtzum is we're going to focus on a particular aspect of a drasha, Shalosh Chodesh drasha, that the Rebbe gave over, Parshas Tazria Tafshin Ayin Daled, so about 8 years ago in 2014, I believe, which again was a year where the Rebbe was being Megala Torah about his Spoididus, he was darshaning Siprei Maisios. So the Torahs of that year are simply incredible, as are all the Torahs. But Derech Klal, the way I learn the Kuntris as it comes out is to start Friday night with Nishmas and Chadasin, and then to go throughout Shabbos day, you go through Nishmas and Chadasin, Tarech Lefanei Shulchan. Sometimes there's going to be Yuma de Hilula. This week they had Hespedim on Rav Chaim Kanievsky, Schus Yogan Aleinu, who the Rebbe was very much makusher to. Then to go through the Daf Yomi, and now there's Yerushalmi, and there's Lumdis also. There's Bava Kama in Yerushalmi that the Rebbe is going through, which is mamish, it's the Lumdis and then the Kabbalah of the Lumdis. And then as you get towards the end of the Kuntris, so there you have the Chaim Haran Shirim, and you have also recently published from older years is the Zohar Kadosh Shirim, which are also, Kodesh HaKadoshim, some of the sweetest Torah, most precise Torah. And then you end with the Torah's Chacham Shir, and the Torah's Chacham Shir is what the Rebbe is doing, and Rav Shmuel Shlita Be'ezras Hashem is going to be publishing, going through the entirety of Torah's Chacham, and not only showing it al derech pshat, but also bringing it down al derech pnimiyas ha'avoda based on Chasidus, which is simply an impossible project, yet it's happening in front of our eyes. The Rebbe added this week also, I saw that the two letters that are very big in the Megillah are Taf and Ches, which hints to the fact that Bishnas Taf Ches, there was a big Hisayrus to Geula, there was a big Hisayrus to redemption, and as we know, Hisayrus to redemption doesn't mean that redemption is Avada coming, it means it's a Zman that's Masilga for Tefillah for redemption, but the Rebbe gave a remez to this by Motzei Purim, and he said that Taf Ches is also Rosh Tevos Torah's Chacham, because the way to be Mamshich Geula is to be loimed the sugyos of the Torah's Chacham. Now, Lefi Aniyas Daiti, that doesn't only mean the svarim of the Torah's Chacham, which is very difficult to learn, although it's becoming easier and easier through the Rebbe's projects, but it also means learning the tzaddik who calls himself and his base medrash al shem Torah's Chacham as well, that there's a hisayrus of geula that a person receives when they enter into the moichin, into the mindset of the Torah's Chacham of Rav Chaim de la Rosa, which is also the mindset of the tzaddik, of the base medrash of the Torah's Chacham. The Rebbe uses a siman where he says that for the Torah's Chacham, the reason the Torah's Chacham is shaykh to geula is because the Torah's Chacham takes two klalim. He takes the klal of Oirich and he takes the klal of Ovi, and he unifies them together to reveal that they're one and the same thing. Bekitzer, and this is not even the Torah we're speaking about tonight, the klal of Oirech, the klal of hierarchical reality is that there's a top and then there's a lower level and a level lower than that and then a level lower than that, like a links in a chain. So the higher level is higher, the lower level is lower, and the middle level is what connects the two. And in that relationship, which we're so used to, which is the hierarchical order of vertical reality, so there's somebody who's higher than me, he learns 18 hours a day, I learn 14 hours a day, they learn 12 hours a day, and that's where kinatayv and kavod come in, and it's a very necessary way of looking at the worlds. All of the worlds are stacked upon each other like layers of a house, as the Arizal tells us. So that's the mahalach of Oirech, of the verticality of reality. And then what the Torah's Chacham comes to be Megala based on the Rashash, which is really based on the Arizal, is that there's another way of looking at reality. There's a three-dimensional way of looking at reality. It's not only height and width, which is the vertical way of the Oirech, but there's also depth, which is Oivi, which teaches us that reality is not one block on top of the other or higher on top of a lower, but rather it's like nesting dolls within each other. Like you open one up and you find the other one is inside, and then there's another layer inside, and it's like a jawbreaker, so to speak, where each and every layer covers over the other, but they're all operating at the same place. So yes, there might be different layers. A might be A, and B might be B, and C might be C, but ultimately they're all equal. And the highest is equal to the lowest. It's just operating at its own personal level. So from the perspective of Oirech, there's absolute difference between levels. From the perspective of Oivi, everything is unified. And even if I'm at the lowest place imaginable, I'm tapping into the highest place imaginable as well. So Zak the Rebbe that the Torah Chacham takes these two ways of looking at the world as something that is operating according to difference, and looking at the world as something that is operating according to unity. And not only does he discuss both of them, but he shows how both of them are true at the very same moment, and that it's dependent on how I look at the world. And when a person is able to look at the world in that way, to realize that in truth everything is different and everything is the same at the very same moment, and all difference only comes about by my relative position, or the way I look at the world, which is referred to as the Soid HaErchin of relativity, that way brings Geula into the world. So that's the Shnas Taf Ches of the Torah's Chacham and the Rebbe's Torah as well. But what we're going to look at tonight, Be'ezras Hashem, is a part of a drasha from Parshas Tazria and Tafshin Ayin Daled. Now the Rebbe opens up with a teaching in Likutei Moharan that discusses how tzitzis, and the mitzvah of tzitzis is a mitzvah that drags a person into the world of Emunah. And on a certain level, the mitzvah of tzitzis, as the Rebbe describes, based on the writings of Rabbi Nachman, is a light that surrounds an individual. The entire person is brought into that light. When a person is covered in tzitzis, it's a makif. I'm no longer thinking about something. I am surrounded by the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and I no longer feel distant and apart. And the Rebbe continues, and he says, based on the parsha, that because to feel apart, to feel separate, to feel lonely, the word that the Rebbe uses very often is bedidus in this mimer, because it's badad yashav, that if a person is not makusher to the light of the Shekhinah HaKadosh, if a person does not connect themselves to the presence of God that is wherever a person is in each and every moment, they will fall into a state of bedidus, of isolation, of aloneness, of feeling that I'm disconnected from Hashem, I'm disconnected from every other person, and I have no place in the world. And the Rebbe says, with a profound insight, which is not surprising, but it is surprising that it makes its way into a Shalashudis drasha, that bedidus is the shoyresh of atzvus. That you want to know where sadness comes from, you want to know where this despondency comes from, a feeling that I can't be successful in this world, that I don't have a place in the world. It comes from a hargasha of bedidus. It comes from a hargasha of being alone, of nobody understanding me, of having nobody to share my inner self with. And when a person is bedidus, when a person experiences that deep isolation and that loneliness, it leads to sadness. And when a person is sad, it leads to a certain deafness. It leads to what Chazal referred to as hacharesh hayalibam, and their hearts were deaf, their hearts could not hear. Because the Tana came to lane Parshas HaChodesh, and instead of saying HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, this newness, this new month is for you, he read Hacharesh Hayalibam. Their heart was closed off to the spiritual sounds and the movements that awake me, that draw me closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so if a person feels isolated in this world with bedidus, disconnected from the Shekhinah, a person ultimately draws themselves into sadness, and then sadness leads to the inability to hear the voice of HaKadosh Baruch Hu crying out to me at every moment. And the Rebbe says that the Ikar Nakuda that we have to connect ourselves to is Nisuin. We have to marry ourselves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have to cleave ourselves to the Shekhinah. And we have to recognize that not only do I need the Shekhinah and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but Kavyachol, the Shekhinah and HaKadosh Baruch Hu need me as well. And that it's a reciprocal relationship. Just as the lower parts of the world need the higher parts of the world, so too the higher parts of the world need the lower parts of the world. And when I can be makasher myself with a deep intensity and marry myself and cleave to the Shekhinah HaKadosh and recognize that there's nothing that exists other than HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this moment, I leave that bedidus. I leave that place. But the Rebbe continues, and this is what we're going to look at on page Ches. The Rebbe continues, and he says, the Iker way to get well, the Iker way to free ourselves from the sickness, from the tsara'as that comes with isolation and loneliness and sadness in our lives, which leads to the inability to hear any of the messages or the Torah of the tzaddikim that come down to us, whispering into our ear that we're okay. The Iker is to receive the strength from the Torah HaKadosha, because the entire purpose of the Torah is to teach us emunah, to believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'mala mitam v'das. But it's not enough to learn Torah. It's not enough to learn Torah for the Torah's sake, as the Rebbe speaks about in this week's Gilyon as well by Nishmas and Chadasin, that the Maharal said in the Hakdama to Tiferes Yisrael that the problem with learning so much Torah is that you forget who gave the Torah, and you become obsessed and in love with the Torah itself. yet you completely forget about the giver of the Torah. And so it's not enough for a person to learn Kol Torah Kula. A person has to learn Kol Torah Kula for the sake of uncovering the connectivity to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Amunah and the Yichud in that moment. V'hinei ata magia Chodesh Nisan. And now we're entering into the month of Nisan, and a person has to understand how to count the shkalim properly, how to understand the value of themselves. Ve'in eitza la'adam lihinatzel, ki mamshichin min hashamayim la'adam ad shigia l'tikan hanachon. And the Rebbe says something very powerful. He says, there is no way to be saved from the place that we need to end up in. Each and every person is going to have their tikkun. Each and everything in reality is going to have their tikkun. There's no freeing ourselves from that slow and steady march towards our tikkun. We have to go through this world. We have to go through the tikkun, which is what the Inyan of Maror on Leil Pesach is. Because either a person can see this world as Mar Dror, that beautiful scent of Mordechai HaTzadik that a person connects to on Purim, which is the aspect of Besamim and the aspect of Cherus and freedom. Or a person v'yacholios maror b'bechinas merirus, or a person can fall into bedidus and merirus in this world, sadness and bitterness. V'hakol tali ba'adam, and it's up to the individual themselves. Either way, I'm going to get to the end of the journey. The question is, how am I going to get to the end of the journey? Am I going to get there through Marjror, through the Kayach of Purim, through the Kayach of Yesod Abba, and the Giloy that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with me everywhere, like Mordechai HaTzadik, who connects to HaKadosh Baruch Hu specifically in a place of distance? Or is it going to be through Mariris, which the Arizal tells us is the gematria of Maves? V'akol toli ba'adam, it's up to me. Ki im yechanes levado le'emuna v'tfila yeh b'chinas marjor. Because if I enter in my own experience, with my solitude, not with anybody else, and I enter into that place of faith and tefillah, then it's going to be freedom. Ach im lo, but if I can't, azay behechrech, then God forbid I'm going to have to come to my tikkun through the aspect of merirus, through bitterness, which is the aspect of all of the bitterness and the sadness and the isolation and that deafness that a person can experience in this world. The Moror gematria Maves, says the Rebbe, and Moror is the gematria of Maves. Ki im ha'adam chai b'zeh ha'olam b'li ha'or ha'eloki. Because if a person lives their lives in this world without the godly light that enlivens every aspect of our machshava, dibor, and maisa, harei zeh b'bechinas misa, then we're in an aspect of death. HaKadosh Baruch Hu memashkin ha'adam, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu ensures that the person v'shum echad ein yachal linatzel, and no person can save themselves from this. We're going to come to our tikkun in the end of the day. It's just a question of how do we come to our tikkun. Kamay shekasav, like the pasuk says, v'haya ekev tishma'un. And in the end, if you hear, listen to the way the Rebbe teaches this pasuk, shelabasof bebechinas ekev, when it comes to the end, which is the aspect of the heel, which is ekev, muchrach shiagia kol echad letishma'un. When we reach the end, there's no question of whether we're going to hear our tikkun or not. We're avada going to hear our tikkun. Ach chaval l'chakos sheyachrichu oso. But it's not a good thing. It's pathetic. It's sad if a person waits long enough that they're going to be forced to understand their tikkun. Ki ha'bechira biyado im lahagia al yedei marjror o chas v'shalom al yedei moror shel bechinas meriras. Because it's up to us how we leave that bedidus, how we free ourselves, how we connect ourselves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's ultimately dependent on our bechira. And here the Rebbe goes weiter. And we'll read quickly through some of the words because they're not necessarily part of what I'm trying to bring out from this Nakuda, but obviously to read the words because it's the Rebbe's Torah. Ubiyam Hashmini Yimol Basar Arlaso. So the Pasuk, after describing the Bedidus that a person goes through when they find themselves stuck in this world, so it goes on to talk about the Bris Milah, which takes place on the 8th day. Ki HaTorah v'HaTfila tzrichem lehizkasher ke'echad besod az yashir Moshe. That we know from Rabbi Nassan and from Rabbi Nachman that the Tachlis is not simply to learn Torah, but rather to transform the Torah into tefillah, so that every nekuda and word of Torah that we learn is not chas v'shalom for the sake of falling in love with the Torah itself, but it's for the sake of falling in love and cleaving and becoming married to the giver of the Torah. And that's the aspect of connecting the Torah and tefillah, which is az yashir, the aleph and the zayin, which correspond to the 8th day, shu b'bechina shmini sha'ila az, which is the aspect of the 8th day, that level of bina where Torah and tefillah are connected, is represented by the word az, ki haTorah atzmo machnisa lichad ve'emuna. Because Torah learning brings a person to unity and to faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ach tzarech likasher haTorah im hatfilos v'abakashos. But it's not enough to just learn Torah. We have to connect our Torah learning to the desire to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in our hearts, to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to seek out HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ki hashemos v'yichudim him b'chinas Torah. Because the Torah is the aspect of the names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and ways of permutations of Hashem's name. But v'tzarech likasher oisam im b'chinas hatfila. But we have to connect that to the aspect of tefillah, which is the deep dying sense that if I don't connect to you right now, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I can't live in this world. A person, if they're connected to Torah alone, fine, they could get the sense that I could live off of Torah. But the sense of tefillah is that, Rebbeinu Shalom, I cannot live one more second without you in this world. And we have to take the aspect of Torah, which is the aspect of Aleph, and connect it to the aspect of tefillah, which is the aspect of Zayin, V'hu Sod Az Yashir. And it's the secret of the Ches Yemei Milah. We absolutely are stuck in the absolute necessity to enter into this mindset to destroy the distractions. Because if a person can't connect their Torah to their tefillah, if a person can't connect their sense of wholeness to their sense of deficiency, their sense of having something to the sense of not having anything without Hashem, then they can't enter into that place of az tis'aneg al Hashem, to that place of Az, of Aleph Zion, of the Yichud of Torah and Tefillah, which is the Tachlis of Tainug. And at that moment, Harihu nofel me'oineg lenega chas v'shalom. And at that point, the person falls from the life of Oineg, from the life of Tainug, from a sense of connectivity and connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of inner pleasure, which gives me the sense that I am right here, right now, and I have everything that I need. And I chas v'shalom fall into that place of nega, of that nega tsaras, of sitting in bedidus, of being alone and isolated without anything to help me. Shehu inyan mirirusa dahaya alma. And this inyan of the nega tsaras, of that bedidus, is the pain and the bitterness of what it means to be a person in this world. Because if we don't force ourselves to enter into the wisdom of tefillah, into that place of connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu no matter what, into the bechina of the yichudim b'derech tefillah b'soid mayim shalanu, into the connectivity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu by way of finding Hashem in my tefillos, harehu nofel bechinas bedidus. Then I fall into a place of isolation again, of solitude, of loneliness. Bechinas badad yashav michutz lamachane. And at that point, I'm sitting alone outside of the camp. And at that moment, listen to the words of the Rebbe, Margish atzmo badad legamer b'zeha oilam. And in that moment, the person feels totally isolated and removed from society, removed from everybody, alone with nobody to reach out to, alone with nobody to help. V'lo ozer lo chaverim. And the friends at that point are not going to be enough. Because how could a friend help a person who feels like they're entirely alone? They won't even believe that they have friends. There are times, and the Rebbe quotes this in the name of the Beis Yisrael very often, that the siyata d'shmaya that a person has is a good friend who comes along to offer a little bit of insight. But b'derech klal, even our friends can't save us from this isolation and this low place. Ach ka'asher ma'avid ha'emuna chas v'shalom, harehu bebechinas badad yashav michutz l'machane. When a person forgets about connecting to the inner essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in those moments, we're isolated, we're outside of the camp. Ki ein lo shaychus im hashchina. At that point, the person doesn't feel that they have any shaychus to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world. We have no relationship to Hashem. V'harehu kamo Kayin. And at that point, we're like Kayin, because what happened by Kayin? Kayin was a Reitzeach. Kayin murdered Hevel. Kayin was alone. Kayin was left alone in the universe. Where is your brother? HaKadosh Baruch Hu asks. And Kayin says, Hashem rachi anochi, I don't know. I'm alone in this universe. And what was Kayin's punishment? And Kayin's punishment is to wander the land, to feel alone. And any place that Kayin finds himself, ein margish es makomo. He doesn't feel like he's in the right place. And he's isolated and he's never quite in the right place. And wherever he is the wrong place for him. And the desire of Kayin is to run there to find it, to run here to find it. Wherever I am is the wrong place. I have to go elsewhere to find it. And wherever he goes, he's not going to find himself. The neshama of Kayin, the neshama of Bedidus, that person who can't connect to that emuna, that person who's stuck in Mirusa Deha Alma, they have no place in the world. Umasha Oisa Hunavanad, all he does is wander backwards and forwards. Margish Badad Yashav Michutz Lamachana. And at that point, he feels completely removed, completely alone, anxious. But listen to what the Rebbe says. Because as long as a person is not connected to the innermost point of the Shekhinah HaKadosh and the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, exactly where I am in this moment as I exist right now, and to the deep sense of Amunah that is there with me no matter where I have fallen, if a person can't connect to that, then nothing is going to help them. The only eitzah, the only suggestion in the world is throwing oneself into Emunah. And through Emunah, at that point, when I enter into a place of Emunah, I realize I am exactly where I need to be. I'm not badad, I'm not alone, I'm with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. At that moment, I'm able to say that Mishi yesh l'lev Yisraeli ein shayach l'makom klal. As Rabbi Nachman tells us, that someone who has a heart, a Jewish heart, there's no concept of space by them because it's Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu. Sheyimtza HaMakom HaNachon al Yidei Shakadosh Baruch Hu Yitein Lo HaMakom HaNachon V'Chaverim HaNachonim B'chol Davar. Because when a person connects to Amunah, they realize that my friends that I have and the place that I'm in is exactly what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving me. V'rak HaKadosh Baruch Hu nosen HaMakom LaAdam. And only HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives a place to a person. Baruch Shenosan Torah L'Am Yisrael. Blessed is he who gave the Torah to Bnei Yisrael. Kadosh Baruch Hu nosen Torah LaAdam. Because only HaKadosh Baruch Hu has the tachbulos to save me from my bedidus and my berirus. Ulachein mamashchin min hashamayim es ha'adam. And therefore Shamayim pushes and compels a person. Ulapamim noisnin lo kol minei merirus. And Shamayim sends all modes of bitterness into the person's heart. Why? Kedei she'achriach atzmo lahagia l'das hanachon shel tefillah. The entire tachlis of the merirus that descends into our heart as a message from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the feeling of being alone, the feeling of bedidus, that's all there for the sake of us pushing ourselves even further and realizing that the only thing that can possibly help me is the das of tefillah, is to throw myself unabashedly into amunah and davening. And even though it's good to go out into the field, it's good to make an asek out of this, and that's very, very good. Do the avodah of tefillah in the right way. A person doesn't have to wait to be able to go out into the field. It's not enough to go out to the field. I have to learn, like we said in a previous year, to transform my home into a field, to find HaKadosh Baruch Hu exactly where I am, right here, right now. Everything is present in front of me with the das of Amunah and the das of Tefillah. And a person has to enter into the innermost interiority of das, which Rabbeinu HaKadosh tells us is the ability to build the Beis HaMikdash in our minds. Why? Ki rega ba'apo chaim bertzono. Because the pasuk tells us that there's a moment of anger, but life is eternal. Perush, de ba'oisai rega shemargish af. In that very moment that I feel difficulty, specifically there, in the depths of that despair, in that merirusa d'alma, in that place of bedidus, in that place of feeling alone without anybody else. At that moment, I can force myself into the place of chaim b'ritzono, lichanes la'emunah l'tfila, to enter into that world of emunah and tefillah. Ki b'chol matziv v'matziv she'over ala adam im choyshev ala kadosh baruch hu u'poina alav, because in any moment that a person finds themselves in, any place that a person finds themselves in, if they think about HaKadosh Baruch Hu and they turn themselves internally towards prayer and towards yichudim by way of davening, to say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, all of this Torah I've learned, all of the ideas I have, just help me ta'azreini. Like Rabbi Nassan says, ta'azreini, as long as a person can still say the word ta'azreini, then they have life of spirituality coursing through their blood. Harihu miyad zoicha l'chaim b'ritzono. At that moment, the person is immediately connected to the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the reason I wanted to pick this Torah is because very rarely, at least for me, do I find the Rebbe speaking in this lashon, especially by Shalosh Shudas Drasha, of the bedidus that a person naturally feels in this world, of the mirusa da'alma, of the tendency towards bitterness. It's a choice that a person has to make. And what the Rebbe is teaching us is that even if you find yourself in the lowest place imaginable, even if you find yourself alone, drinking the maror of the world, eating the maror of the world, despondent and tossed away, chutz min hamachana, at that moment, not only is it possible to find the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Bechina of Hamakim Yinachem Eschem, to realize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in my heart wherever I am, but it's specifically there that we have the ability to uncover the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Bedidus and the Bilbulim and the Merirus are a Heicha Timsa, they're a Hechsher Mitzvah towards connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu as I am, where I am, and when I am in this very moment, Be'ezras Hashem.